In the fertile lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where the first civilizations had risen from the cradle of humanity, there ruled a king whose name would echo through the ages with both reverence and terror. Nebuchadnezzar II, sovereign of the mighty Babylonian Empire, had built his kingdom into the greatest power the world had ever known. His capital city of Babylon was a marvel of engineering and architecture. Its hanging gardens counted among the wonders of the ancient world. Its ziggurats reaching toward the heavens like fingers of ambition, made manifest in brick and mortar. The king had been born into greatness, the son of Nabopolassar, who had freed Babylon from Assyrian rule and established the Neo-Babylonian Empire. From his earliest days, young Nebuchadnezzar had been groomed for power, educated by the finest scribes and priests, trained in the arts of war and diplomacy. He learned to read the cuneiform tablets that contained the accumulated wisdom of millennia, studied the movements of the stars that governed the fate of nations, and mastered the complex rituals that maintained the favor of the gods. When he ascended to the throne in his 25th year, Nebuchadnezzar had already proven himself as a military commander of exceptional skill. He had led campaigns against the Egyptians, the Assyrians, and the rebellious cities of the Levant, expanding Babylon's borders until they stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. His armies were the most disciplined and well-equipped in the known world, his siege engines capable of reducing the mightiest fortifications to rubble. The king's greatest triumph had come with the conquest of Jerusalem, the holy city of the Hebrews. After a brutal siege that lasted nearly 2 years, the city had fallen, its temple destroyed, its treasures carried off to Babylon along with thousands of captives. Among these prisoners were the prophet Daniel and his companions, men whose faith in their invisible God would soon play a crucial role in the king's destiny. Nebuchadnezzar had initially viewed these Hebrew captives with a mixture of curiosity and contempt, but their wisdom and their ability to interpret dreams had gradually earned his grudging respect. For 43 years, Nebuchadnezzar ruled with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove. His empire prospered under his guidance, trade routes flourished, and the arts reached new heights of sophistication. The king commissioned vast building projects that employed thousands of workers, created elaborate gardens that required complex irrigation systems, and patronized scholars who pushed the boundaries of mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. His court was a center of learning and culture, attracting the brightest minds from across the known world. Yet beneath the surface of this golden age, something dark was stirring in the king's mind. The absolute power he wielded, the constant adulation of his subjects, and the seemingly endless string of military victories had begun to warp his perception of reality. He started to believe that he was not merely a king appointed by the gods, but a divine being in his own right, deserving of worship and reverence equal to Marduk himself. The line between mortal ruler and immortal deity became increasingly blurred in his thoughts. The first signs of his mental deterioration appeared during the construction of his most ambitious project, a massive golden statue that stood 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. The statue was a representation of himself, crafted from the finest gold and decorated with precious stones that caught the light like captured stars. He decreed that all citizens of the empire must bow down and worship the statue whenever the ceremonial music played, under penalty of death in the fiery furnace. When the Hebrew captives Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to worship the golden image, Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage that surprised even his closest advisors with its intensity. He ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than usual and had the 3 men thrown into the flames. The heat was so intense that it killed the soldiers who threw them in, yet the 3 Hebrews emerged unharmed, protected by what they claimed was the power of their God. This incident should have humbled the king, but instead, it only fueled his growing obsession with divine power and his bitter resentment toward any force that seemed to challenge his authority. The breaking point came during the 35th year of his reign, when Nebuchadnezzar experienced a dream so vivid and terrifying that it haunted his waking hours. In the dream, he saw himself as a great tree that provided shade and sustenance to all the creatures of the earth. The tree grew until it reached the heavens, its branches spreading across the entire world. But then a holy watcher descended from heaven and commanded that the tree be cut down, its branches stripped away, its fruit scattered to the winds. Only the stump was to remain, bound with iron and bronze, wet with the dew of heaven. The king summoned his magicians, astrologers, and wise men to interpret the dream, but none could provide a satisfactory explanation. Finally, he called for Daniel, the Hebrew prophet who had interpreted his dreams before. Daniel listened to the king's account with growing horror, recognizing the divine judgment that was about to fall upon the monarch. With great reluctance, he explained that the tree represented Nebuchadnezzar himself, and that the dream foretold a period of madness during which the king would lose his reason and live like a wild beast until he acknowledged that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of men. Nebuchadnezzar dismissed Daniel's interpretation with contempt, convinced that no god could touch him in his magnificent palace, surrounded by his mighty army. He had conquered nations, built wonders, and accumulated wealth beyond imagination. Surely such achievements proved that he was beyond the reach of divine retribution. For a full year after the dream, he continued to rule with the same arrogance and self-deification that had characterized his later years, growing ever more convinced of his own divinity. The transformation began on a day that had started like any other. Nebuchadnezzar was walking on the roof of his royal palace, surveying the great city of Babylon that sprawled beneath him like a jewel set in the desert. The hanging gardens cascaded down the terraced walls, their exotic plants and flowers creating a paradise that seemed to defy the harsh climate of Mesopotamia. The great ziggurat of Etemenanke rose in the distance, its peak lost in the clouds, while the broad processional way stretched toward the massive Ishtar Gate, with its brilliant blue-glazed bricks decorated with golden dragons and bulls. As he gazed upon his achievements, pride swelled in the king's heart until it threatened to burst from his chest. He raised his arms toward the heavens and proclaimed in a voice that echoed across the city below that everything he saw was the work of his own hands, built for the glory of his majesty and the display of his honor. The words had barely left his lips when he felt something snap inside his mind, like a taut rope suddenly severed. A voice seemed to speak from the heavens, declaring that his kingdom had been taken from him and that he would be driven from human society to live with the wild animals until 7 periods of time had passed. The change was instantaneous and horrifying. Nebuchadnezzar's carefully cultivated rationality crumbled like a sandcastle before the tide. His eyes, once sharp and calculating, became wild and unfocused, darting constantly from side to side as if tracking invisible threats. His speech, formerly eloquent and commanding, devolved into guttural sounds and incoherent babbling. The courtiers who witnessed this transformation were paralyzed with shock, unable to comprehend how their mighty sovereign could be reduced to such a state in the span of a few heartbeats. The king's condition deteriorated rapidly over the following days. He began to exhibit behaviors that were more animal than human, prowling on all fours through the palace corridors, sniffing at the air as if detecting scents that others could not perceive. His diet changed from the refined cuisine of the royal kitchen to whatever he could forage, including grass, leaves, and even insects. The palace staff watched in horror as their once mighty ruler grazed like cattle in the palace gardens, his royal robes becoming increasingly tattered and soiled. As weeks turned to months, the physical changes became as pronounced as the mental ones. Nebuchadnezzar's carefully groomed beard grew wild and unkempt, matting with dirt and debris until it resembled the coat of a wild animal. His fingernails, once manicured and clean, grew long and curved like talons, becoming weapons that he used to tear at his food and scratch at his increasingly filthy skin. His hair, which had once been oiled and styled in the fashion of Babylonian nobility, became a tangled mass that hung about his shoulders like a lion's mane. The king's body began to adapt to his new lifestyle in ways that defied natural explanation. His skin grew thick and leathery, providing protection against the elements as he spent more time outdoors. His muscles, once soft from palace luxury, became wiry and strong from constant movement and foraging. His senses sharpened to an almost supernatural degree, allowing him to detect the approach of humans from great distances, and to find food sources that others would overlook. The most disturbing change was in his eyes, which had once been windows to a brilliant, if prideful mind. They now held the vacant, instinctual gaze of a wild creature, showing no recognition of former friends or advisors. When courtiers attempted to approach him, he would bare his teeth and emit low, growling sounds that sent them fleeing in terror. The great king who had once commanded the respect and fear of the known world had become something that inspired only pity and revulsion. The palace physicians were summoned to examine the king, but they found themselves dealing with a condition that lay beyond their understanding. They tried various treatments, from herbal remedies to ritualistic cleansings, but nothing seemed to have any effect on his condition. The court astrologers consulted the stars and the omens, searching for some celestial explanation for their monarch's affliction, but the heavens remained silent. The priests performed elaborate ceremonies to appease the gods, but Nebuchadnezzar's madness only seemed to deepen with each passing day. As the king's condition became more widely known, the stability of the empire began to suffer. Provincial governors questioned orders from the capital, wondering if they came from the mad king or from the regents who had assumed control in his absence. Enemy nations, sensing weakness, began to test the borders with increasingly bold raids. Trade routes that had been secure for decades became targets for bandits who no longer feared Babylonian retaliation. The great empire that Nebuchadnezzar had spent his life building began to show signs of stress and potential collapse. The palace staff faced the daily challenge of caring for a ruler who no longer recognized them as human beings. They had to develop new strategies for feeding him, as he would only eat food that he found or caught himself. They tried to maintain some semblance of his former dignity by keeping him clean and clothed, but he would tear off any garments they put on him and would violently resist any attempts at grooming. The magnificent royal chambers became a prison, with reinforced doors and barred windows to prevent the king from escaping into the city where his condition would become common knowledge. The isolation took its toll on everyone involved. The queen, who had once been the king's closest confidant, found herself unable to bear the sight of what her husband had become. The princes, who had been raised to respect their father as the earthly representative of the gods, struggled to reconcile their childhood memories with the bestial creature that now inhabited the palace. Even the most loyal servants began to whisper among themselves, wondering if the king's condition was punishment from the gods, or simply the natural result of a mind pushed beyond its limits by absolute power. As the seasons changed, Nebuchadnezzar's physical condition continued to deteriorate. His skin, constantly exposed to the elements and lacking proper hygiene, developed numerous sores and infections. His long fingernails became breeding grounds for bacteria, leading to chronic infections that caused his fingers to swell and discolor. His unkempt hair became home to various parasites that fed on his scalp, causing constant itching and scratching that left raw wounds across his head and neck. The king's diet of grass, leaves, and whatever else he could forage provided little nutrition for a human body, leading to deficiencies that manifested in various ways. His teeth began to loosen and fall out, making it even more difficult for him to eat proper food. His vision, already clouded by his mental condition, became further impaired by nutritional deficiencies. His bones grew brittle from lack of proper minerals, making him more susceptible to injuries from his increasingly erratic behavior. The stench that emanated from the king's body became so overwhelming that even the palace staff could barely tolerate being in the same room with him. His clothes, when he wore them at all, became repositories for filth and decay. The magnificent chambers that had once hosted foreign dignitaries and important ceremonies now reeked of human waste and rotting food. The beautiful tapestries and precious furnishings became stained and damaged by the king's increasingly destructive behavior. Yet, through all of this physical and mental deterioration, there seemed to be some part of Nebuchadnezzar's consciousness that remained aware of his condition. Occasionally, observers would catch glimpses of recognition in his eyes, moments when the fog of madness would lift just enough to reveal the trapped soul of the once mighty king. These moments were perhaps the most heartbreaking of all, as they suggested that somewhere within the bestial exterior, the real Nebuchadnezzar was still present. witnessing his own degradation but powerless to stop it. The 7 years of his affliction passed slowly, each day bringing new challenges for those who cared for him. The empire managed to survive under the guidance of his regents, though it never regained the strength and unity that had characterized his earlier reign. The great building projects were abandoned, the military campaigns were postponed, and the cultural achievements that had made Babylon the envy of the world gradually faded into memory. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the madness lifted. On a morning that seemed no different from any other, Nebuchadnezzar looked up from his grazing, and his eyes cleared. The wild, animal-like gaze was replaced by the intelligent, calculating look that had once struck fear into the hearts of his enemies. He stood slowly, his joints creaking from years of living like a beast, and for the first time in 7 years, he spoke in a voice that was recognizably human. The king's first words were not commands or demands, but a prayer of acknowledgement to the Most High, recognizing that the God of the Hebrews ruled over the kingdoms of men and appointed whomever he chose to rule them. The proud monarch who had once declared himself equal to the gods now humbled himself before the one true deity, acknowledging that all his achievements were ultimately dependent on divine favor rather than his own strength and wisdom. The restoration of Nebuchadnezzar's sanity was accompanied by a gradual return to his former physical appearance. His hair and nails returned to normal length, his skin regained its healthy color, and his posture straightened from the hunched, animal-like stance he had maintained for so long. The infections and sores that had plagued him during his years of madness healed with miraculous speed, leaving him physically renewed despite the ordeal he had endured. The king's return to power was marked by a new humility and wisdom that had been absent from his earlier reign. He issued proclamations acknowledging the sovereignty of the God of the Hebrews, declaring that his dominion was everlasting and his kingdom endured from generation to generation. He restored Daniel and his companions to positions of honor and used their wisdom to guide his decisions. The empire, which had teetered on the edge of collapse during his absence, began to stabilize under his renewed but more measured leadership. Yet the experience had left its mark on Nebuchadnezzar in ways that would never fully heal. The memories of his years as a beast haunted his dreams, and he would sometimes wake in the night believing that he was still living in the palace gardens, foraging for food like an animal. The courtiers who had witnessed his transformation treated him with a mixture of renewed respect and barely concealed fear, never quite sure whether the madness might return without warning. The king's remaining years were spent in reflection and attempts at redemption. He sought to undo some of the damage caused by his earlier pride and arrogance, treating his subjects with greater compassion and showing mercy to those who had previously felt the weight of his wrath. He became a patron of the Hebrew captives, allowing them to practice their religion freely and even supporting the eventual return of some of them to their homeland. The story of Nebuchadnezzar's transformation became a cautionary tale that spread throughout the ancient world, a reminder that even the mightiest rulers were subject to forces beyond their control. It spoke to the dangers of unchecked pride and the importance of recognizing the limits of human power. The king himself ensured that the story was recorded in the official chronicles of his reign, wanting future generations to learn from his experience and avoid the terrible fate that had befallen him. When Nebuchadnezzar finally died, he was remembered not only as the great conqueror and builder, but also as the king who had experienced the ultimate humiliation and emerged from it with a deeper understanding of the nature of power and authority. His transformation from human to beast and back to human again became a symbol of the capacity for both degradation and redemption that exists within every person, regardless of their station in life. The legacy of his madness lived on long after his death, inspiring countless retellings and interpretations. Some saw it as divine judgment upon a prideful ruler, others as a medical condition that had been misunderstood by the people of his time. But all agreed that the story of Nebuchadnezzar's 7 years of madness remained one of the most powerful examples of how quickly and completely a human being could be reduced to their most basic animal-like state, and how miraculous it was when reason and humanity were restored.